Hey all you cool cats and kittens, welcome back to Remote Learning with Miss Corwin. We are on Narrative Writing Day 2. So just to recap, we are going to be beginning to write our own stories, things that have actually happened to us in the past. These are true stories about our true lives, our memories, and our feelings. So as we go through Day 2, we're going to start talking about what does a story actually look like? What does it take to make a story? And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about the basic story structure. And you may have also seen this be called a plot diagram or a story mountain. But essentially, most stories follow a very specific pattern. And here's what that pattern looks like. So you may have seen this before, you may not have seen this before, it's a-okay. This is what we're going to be talking about for today though. So this is what most stories look like. This is kind of the pattern that most stories follow. So most stories, we're going to start over here where it says beginning, or after that thing goes away, it says beginning. And we begin with something called the exposition. We had an assignment a couple weeks ago talking about the exposition of Midnight Without a Moon. Essentially, the exposition is the part of the story that introduces us to who is the story about, so who are our characters, where are they, when are they living, and just a little bit of background information that will help us understand the story better. So in Midnight Without a Moon, our exposition, it talked about how our main characters are Rosalie, she's living with her grandparents, she lives in Mississippi, and it's 1955, and she's black. Those are all very important things that will help us understand the story better as we continue reading. Originally on this plot diagram here, they didn't include the spot that says Inciting Incident. I thought it was really important to include this. An inciting incident is a moment in the book where something happens that really gets the rest of the story going. So in Midnight Without a Moon, I would argue the point where that happens is where that one neighbor of Rose and her family, he was shot for registering to vote. I'd say it was the inciting incident occurred even before Emmett Till was even mentioned in the book, because this is the point where we start to see, oh wow, there's a big problem happening in Mississippi right now. People are getting shot for registering to vote. Specifically, black people are getting shot for registering to vote. Black people are getting killed for doing things that are perfectly legal. So this is also the point in the story where Aunt Belle comes down and she starts talking about helping people register to vote, and we find that Aunt Belle's a pretty major character later. So the inciting incident is like the moment in the story that helps get us going. If that moment hadn't happened, we would just be in exposition forever, just watching people live regular, normal lives forever. This is where things start to happen. After that, we start to see conflict or rising action. A lot of times this whole line right here is referred to as the rising action. What we mean by rising action is this is the point where things are starting to happen. There's more and more things that are happening in this story that are all working towards the same goal. They're all working towards the end of the book. So if we're talking about Midnight Without a Moon, we are talking about all those cases where Hallelujah is talking about the NAACP. We're talking about Aunt Belle talking about the NAACP. In here, I would also include Emmett Till getting killed. It's all the things that keep making the story move forward. And we're not quite sure where the book is going to end up yet when we're reading all of these points. Then we get to this point right here. This is referred to as the climax, and as you can see, it's the very tippy top of the story. So here, the climax is going to be essentially where all of this action kind of just stops. Something happens and it makes all of the action stop. In Midnight Without a Moon, I would argue that the climax of the book would be where they discovered that Emmett Till's murderers are going to get away with the crime. They're not going to be found guilty, because everything kind of stops after that. So this is the point in the story that everything's kind of been working to. You can kind of see where the book is going to end once you get to this point. Afterwards, we have what's called the falling action. So here we have the rising action, then we start ending up with the falling action. The falling action is kind of just those bits of the book that are helping to get everything all wrapped up. So here, this is like where Rose has decided to get baptized. It doesn't really have to do anything with the plot anymore. It doesn't really have to do anything with that whole NAACP side of the story, but it's something that had to happen in the book too. I would also say this is where we found out that Queen was pregnant and that she's really scared. So this is where the falling action takes place. After that, we're now in what's called the end. I'd say the whole green section is pretty much the end of the book. We end with the resolution. The resolution is typically where you see, okay, the book is pretty much at an end now, and then it gets to an end. So here, I would say that would be like that last chapter of Midnight Without a Moon. This is that section where Queen and Hallelujah and Fred Lee and Rose are sitting under the tree talking about what's going to be happening, what's happening in the future. We see Aunt Ruthie come along with all her kids, and Queen help to take care of them a little bit. And I'd say the final spot in the resolution for Midnight Without a Moon is where Rose decides that she is not moving up north with Aunt Belle. That's where our story ends. There's actually a sequel to this book. It's called A Sky Full of Stars. So if you were ever interested in reading that, absolutely go ahead and read that. But that would follow its own arc as well. We would probably learn about the characters a little bit again, something would happen in the book, and then things would build and build and build and build and build until they stopped. Then the book would start to come to an end, and then finally end with the resolution. So this is what most stories look like. Let's talk about another example. Let's talk about the story of Cinderella. So we're going to start with the exposition. Remember, exposition is where we start to talk about the characters, the setting, any background information that we might need to know. So in the exposition, we meet Cinderella and her stepmothers and stepsisters. We also learn at this point that Cinderella's father and mother have both passed away, or depending on the story, her father is away doing business or something. Either way, we learn that Cinderella is here with just her stepmother and her stepsisters. We also see that Cinderella is being treated very poorly by these stepsisters. We learn that the prince is holding a ball at his castle, but that Cinderella can't go. This is going to all be our exposition. So we have these little bits of story, but it kind of just ends with Cinderella can't go. If we never had this inciting incident, then Cinderella would just be living her normal life every single day, and that wouldn't be a very interesting story. So for the inciting incident, I would say that the inciting incident for Cinderella is when the fairy godmother comes and helps Cinderella get to the ball. So the fairy godmother gives her a dress, she gives her a carriage, she gives her all these things to help her get to the ball. I'd say without that point happening in the story, everything would have stayed the same. Cinderella would just be living her normal, sad life until the fairy godmother came. After that, we get the rising action. So Cinderella rides over in the pumpkin carriage. She dances with the prince at the ball, and then at midnight, she has to run away to get back home in time for everything to turn back to normal. But she leaves behind a shoe. I'd say that's going to be all of our rising action. And then for the climax, we find, so I'd actually include here the rising action. The prince finds the shoe, and then he decides that he's going to try and find whoever the woman is who was wearing that shoe originally. I'd say the climax is going to be where the stepmother breaks the shoe. It kind of puts an end to everything that was just happening. They can't really go any further. But Cinderella brings out her matching shoe, and she proves that she was the original owner of the other shoe. That's going to be our climax. That's going to be where our story, if you ended the story right there, it'd be pretty okay, but you'd feel like, whoa, that was a pretty abrupt ending, but I guess that was the whole story. But usually stories don't just end at the climax. They follow the falling action as well. So for the falling action, we also have Cinderella fits into the matching shoe. She and the prince get married. So you could end the story there if you really wanted to, but A lot of times stories like this end with "they lived happily ever after" for a resolution. It doesn't have to be too long. Truthfully, this falling action and resolution section are usually pretty short. They don't take as much time as the exposition, conflict, rising action, climax. They don't usually take that long. So this is what our plot diagram looks like. Our story mountain, as some people call it, a basic structure to a story. Our stories are also going to be having these features in them. And there are 5 things you have to include in every story. Every story has these 5 things in them. The first being characters. Who is this story about? How could you even have a story if you don't talk about who's in the story? So all stories have to have characters. Likewise, all stories have to have a setting. People aren't just existing in some white void. They exist somewhere. So when do they exist? Where do they exist? When you write your story, is this going to be in the summertime when you were 5 years old? Is this going to be last week? Is this going to be taking place when you went camping in Maine maybe? Or if you went to Florida for a Disneyland trip or something like that? So when and where does the story take place? We also have to include the plot. The plot is like what we were just talking about. It's what happens in the story. You can't just have characters in the setting doing nothing. That's not a very interesting story. You have to talk about what is the plot, what is happening in this story. Likewise, there should also be some sort of problem. If you just have a hunky-dory little happy story where everything is good and lovely and whatever, then that's not a very interesting story. There should be some sort of conflict in that story. So what is the problem that exists in this story? And finally, we should have a resolution. This is the same kind of resolution that we talked about here. Resolution, it's how does your story end? How does the problem get fixed? So these are 5 things you need to include in your persuasive writing as well. And you're going to have a chance to do that today. But before we get there, let's talk about how do I write a persuasive narrative. And you have this in one of your slides too. And we talked about this a little bit, but I thought it'd be good for you to have this sort of visual as well. So the first thing they mention is writing about yourself. This is a personal narrative. It means you are writing about things that have happened to you. You are writing about your own life, your own experiences, your own memories, and your own feelings. So that's going to be our first step, is to write about yourself. Number 2 says the emphasis, meaning what you should focus on, should be on something that you have experienced personally. So it's not talking about, oh wow, one time I won the lottery and I built a mansion and then I adopted some pet sharks and we all swam in the pool together. No, it has to be something that actually happened to you, something that you have actually experienced. And you might be thinking, well, I've never done interesting in my whole life. I know you have. I know that you have, because you come in to school or you come chat with me and you tell me, oh my gosh, last night I hung out with my friends and we did this and this. Or you come into school and while you're standing at your lockers, you're talking with your friends about things that you did over the weekend. It doesn't have to be anything exciting. It doesn't have to be anything that's like the most spectacular story you've ever told in your entire life. The story we read yesterday, My Mama Had a Dancing Heart, she was just talking about how she loved being with her mom and how her mom and she would be dancing all the time. That's not super exciting. That's not super wild or special in any sort of way, but it was special to her because it was something that was meaningful to her. Here's going to be a big thing that we're going to talk about. It says write about a small moment. Don't try to write about a giant topic. So, when they say write about a small moment, that's literally what they mean. You're just writing about something that happened to you. It doesn't have to be super exciting or fantastical or anything like that. If you went camping one time and it was really meaningful to you, awesome. Write about that small moment. Keep in mind, like with the story of Cinderella, we didn't learn about Cinderella's whole life. We didn't learn about, oh, what was it like when she did live with her dad? How did her dad meet the stepmother? How did those stepsisters come to be? What's going on? What happened after Cinderella and Prince Charming got married and lived happily ever after? No, the story takes place in pretty much 2 days. It takes place right before she goes to the ball, then she goes to the ball, and then it's the next day when she gets when she gets found by the prince. It only takes a little bit of time. We're going to read a story today that takes place in like one night. Additionally, if you think about some stories, most of the time they aren't a giant topic. They're not talking about somebody's whole life. Sometimes they do, but we're not going to focus on those kind of stories. We're just focusing on these short personal narratives. Tell a story from your point of view. That means instead of, if I was writing a story about myself, I wouldn't say, once upon a time, Samantha Corwin was walking through the fields and she noticed a kitten in the grass meowing. No, instead I would write something like, as I was walking through the grass, I noticed a small meowing sound. I'm going to be mentioning myself. I'm going to put it in first person point of view. First person point of view means I use words like I, my, we, words like that help show that like I'm the one telling the story. I am the narrator. For your story, you will be the narrator. Here it says write the same way you would tell a story to someone. So you don't have to write fancy. You may have read books like Harry Potter or any other just like really intense books like that have like really flowery, amazing, spectacular language. You don't have to write like that. In fact, I think stories are more true when you write them like like how you would tell somebody's story. I think that's why people like the book like Schooled so much, with Capricorn Anderson being a hippie from a commune coming to school. Because all of those points of view that we read, whether it was the daughter or the social worker or the girl who has a crush on him or the nerdy guy or the big tough guy, they were all written like normal speech. So we were able to connect with those characters and understand them better. So just write the way that you would tell a story. We need to make sure this narrative has a beginning, middle, and end. That goes back to this. We need to have that beginning, exposition, inciting incident, middle with our rising action and climax, and end with our falling action and resolution. So we just need to make sure that we have those sort of things. It says don't forget about spelling and capitalization. That's something that we'll do in the editing phase. So if you do better with like speech to text and you're just like speaking out your story, that's totally fine. Go for it, absolutely. And our last thing, make it interesting. Would you want to read it? So I might not suggest you writing a story like, one day I went to the grocery store. I wanted to get Oreos, but my mom said no. I was upset, but I understood. Then I went home and played video games. The end. That's not that interesting. Who wants to read that? I mean, sure, that may have happened to you in real life, but we're trying to write about specific moments that were meaningful to you. So we are now going to be reading this story. It's called Fireflies by Julie Brinklow, I should say. And this story does a really nice job of giving us one small moment of a story. And hopefully it will play.
Fireflies by Julie Brinklow. On a summer evening, I looked up from dinner through the open window to the backyard. It was growing dark. My treehouse was a black shape in the tree, and I wouldn't go up there now. But something flickered there, a moment. I looked, and it was gone. It flickered again, over near the fence. Fireflies. Don't let your dinner get cold, Mama said. I forked the meat and corn and potatoes into my mouth. Please, may I go out? The fireflies. Mama smiled, and Daddy nodded. Go ahead, they said. I ran from the table down to the cellar to find a jar. I knew where to look, behind the stairs. The jars were dusty, and I polished one clean on my shirt. Then I ran back up 2 stairs at a time. Holes, I remembered. so they can breathe. And as quietly as I could, so she wouldn't catch me dulling them, I poked holes in the top of the jar with Mama's scissors. The screen door banged behind me as I ran from the house. If someone said, "Don't slam it," I wasn't listening. I called to my friends in the street, "Fireflies!" But they had come before me with polished jars, and others were coming behind. The sky was darker now. My ears rang with crickets, and my eyes stung from staring too long. I blinked hard as I watched them. Fireflies, blinking on, blinking off, dipping low, soaring high above my head, making white patterns in the dark. We ran like crazy, barefoot in the grass. Catch them, we cried, grasping at the lights. Suddenly a voice called out above the others, "I caught one!" And it was my own. I thrust my hand into the jar and spread it open. The jar glowed like moonlight, and I held it in my hands. I felt a tremble of joy and shouted, "I can catch hundreds!" Then we dashed about, waving our hands in the air like nets, catching 2, 10, hundreds of fireflies, thrusting them into jars, waving our hands for more. Then someone called from my house, "It's time to come in now," and others called from their houses, and it was over. My friends took jars of fireflies to different homes. I climbed the stairs to my room and set the jar on the table by my bed. Mama kissed me and turned out the light. "I caught hundreds," I said. Daddy called from the hallway, "See you later, alligator." "After a while, crocodile," I called back. I caught hundreds of fireflies. In the dark, I watched the fireflies from my bed. They blinked off and on, and the jar glowed like moonlight. But it was not the same. The fireflies beat their wings against the glass and fell to the bottom and lay there. The light in the jar turned yellow, like a flashlight left on too long. I tried to swallow, but something in my throat would not go down, and the light grew dimmer, green, like moonlight underwater. I shut my eyes tight and put the pillow over my head. They were my fireflies. I caught them. They made moonlight in my jar, but the jar was nearly dark. I flung off the covers. I went to the window, opened the jar, and aimed it to the stars. "Fly!" Then the jar began to glow, green, then gold, then white as the moon, and the fireflies poured out into the night. Fireflies, blinking on, blinking off, dipping low, soaring high above my head, making circles around the moon, like dancing stars. I held the jar, dark and empty, in my hands. The moonlight and the fireflies swam in my tears, but I could feel myself smiling.
All right, perfect. So yeah, that was an example of a personal narrative story. It actually wasn't a personal narrative story because this story featured a little boy and this book is written by Julie Brinklow, but it was a good example of what a personal narrative could look like. So if we were to look at, or wrong way, if we were to look at this checklist again, it says write about a small moment. Don't try to write about a giant topic. So that whole story took place in one night. That small moment was just that that boy, whoever it was, I don't think they told us his name, went and caught some fireflies, and that was really special to him. So that's just one small moment. They told the point of view from their point of view, or the story from their point of view, meaning that they said they were my fireflies. I said goodnight to Dad. All these sort of things, and the story really goes through that. And they list those 5 things. So they had characters. There was a little boy who didn't have a name, but there was also the mother and the father and some of the other neighborhood kids. The setting, it was at his house and it was nighttime. So even a setting as simple as that. So the plot. It started out with him eating dinner with his family, and then it ended up with him going outside to go get the Fireflies, and then he went inside, and then we'll come to the conflict. The conflict is the Fireflies weren't doing well in the jar. They weren't glowing anymore. They were starting to turn dim, and truthfully, they were probably starting to die. So that is the problem. So how did they fix that problem? How did the problem get fixed? He set the Fireflies free, and that was the end of the story. So, your job for today is to complete the narrative writing thought chart on slide number 4. So on slide number 4, it doesn't look quite like this, but there is a spot that says characters, setting, plot, conflict, resolution. You don't have to include too much. You can even just tell me like one word answers. If the character is me, my mom, my little brother, sure. Setting, if you want to say it was nighttime, it was autumn, it was whenever it was, if you want to say that it was in 2010, sure, whenever the story took place, perfect. Plot, if you want to just give me a little bit about what happened, then go for it. This is when we're actually going to be starting to brainstorm more about our stories and our ideas. So look back to that heart chart, that heart map. That will help you come up with which story you would like to tell. Everyone is full of stories. You are full of stories to tell. And now it's time to just pick one to talk about. What was the problem that happened in your story? It could even be as simple as, oh, we were running out of time. It could be something along the lines of, or if you were writing about like going to Disney World, maybe. What is the problem in the story? Was it really hot? I've been to Florida. I've been to Disney World. It is really hot there. What is the problem? It doesn't have to be a major problem. In this story with the Fireflies, the problem was just the Fireflies weren't doing well in the jar. So tell me what the problem is, and then how did that problem get fixed? But that's all I have for you today. So let me know if you have any comments or questions or concerns. I'd be more than happy to help you. But I'm going to leave you right there to get started on slide number 4 of your writing chart. Bye, everybody.